I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, the podcast that seeks to expand our understanding of beauty, what it is, how it works, and why it matters for the work we do. This season of the podcast is sponsored by John Templeton Foundation and Templeton Religion Trust. Hey everybody, we've just wrapped up season 3 of the Beauty at Work podcast, which was on the theme of yearning, and I hope you enjoyed the episodes. This is the second bonus episode that I promised you, and it is also from the New York Encounter, which is an annual 3-day public cultural event held in the heart of New York City, offering opportunities for education, dialogue, and friendship. In this panel, I have the honor of interviewing MIT sociologist and psychologist Sherry Turkle and Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam about loneliness and social isolation, which are themes that we've discussed earlier in this season of the podcast. I think their discussion, and especially their insights on the role of technology, are very germane to our season's theme on yearning, especially in relation to our yearning for connection in these troubled times. Let's get started. All right. Good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the New York Encounter, I want to welcome everybody here, those of us joining us in person, in the flesh, at the Metropolitan Pavilion, and also those of us joining us online. I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, a professor of sociology at the Catholic University of America, and I will moderate this conversation. Before we begin, I want to thank Somos for generously sponsoring this panel, and I invite Ms. Raquel Milamore, Director of Behavioral Health and Social Work at Somos, to share a few words about what Somos does and its mental health impact.
It's an honor to be here today, right before such an important conversation on loneliness and malaise. And I know I'm not the main event here. Think of me as your commercial break or that ad you can't skip before the video. But trust me, what I'm about to share connects directly to the discussion ahead. My name is Raquel Milamore. I'm the Director of Behavioral Health at Somos Community Care. You all have these little blue pamphlets on your chair. So I am here to tell you about this organization, an organization that is not only transforming healthcare, but actively addressing the very crisis of disconnection that Professor Putnam and Dr. Turkle are here to discuss today. At Somos, we believe that health is not just about medicine, it's about connection. We're a physician-led network dedicated to improving healthcare in some of the most underserved communities in New York City. And we know that you can't separate physical health from mental health, because anyone who's ever had a doctor's appointment before their morning coffee know that mental health is seriously important, right? In all seriousness, we see firsthand how social isolation, financial struggles, and systemic barriers make mental health challenges hard. However, we also see how human connection restores them. That's why at Somos, we integrate behavioral health into the primary care level, because people are more likely to seek help when it's accessible, familiar, and stigma-free. Through programs like our Impact Model, we provide real-time mental health interventions right at the doctor's office. It's like a one-stop shop, except you're not getting snacks and soda, you're getting support, healing, and connection. So I was recently moved by this talk that I watched on YouTube from last year's SEEKS conference by Dr. Matthew Brininger, a clinical psychologist. And he shared this story about a 5-year-old boy in therapy who had been removed from an unsafe and extremely abusive home. This little guy came into therapy and he was furious. He had just been separated from his family. He was flipping chairs. He was screaming. He was cursing. He was threatening to hurt himself and the doctor. Now, if you've ever been around a 5-year-old, you know they can be dramatic, right? But this was different. He was in survival mode, overwhelmed by fear and pain. And what did the therapist do? He didn't yell, he didn't scold. Instead, he simply held him, gently but firmly, until the little boy's body softened, his breathing slowed, and he just collapsed in this doctor's arms, crying and finally letting go and finding rest. Why is this important? At this moment, he didn't need words. He needed presence. He needed to know he was safe. This story resonated with me because in many ways, this is what we seek to do at Somos, not just offer services, but restore connection. Our work isn't about treating symptoms, not just about treating symptoms. It's about seeing people, standing with them in their suffering and saying, you are not alone. We are here. We live in a time when loneliness has become an epidemic. And honestly, that's kind of wild, right? Because on your birthday, you can get 1,000 happy birthday messages on Facebook, but still eat that cake alone. The reality is that despite technology, more people than ever feel unseen, unheard, and disconnected. But what if the solution wasn't complicated? What if it was as simple as showing up, listening, and holding space for someone else? This is the heart of our work. At Somos, we train healthcare providers in trauma-informed care. We host community mental health events, wellness workshops, and we bring mental health into the community, into the street. And this is why this is so important, this discussion today. Loneliness and malaise aren't just social issues, they're a public health crisis. They affect our well-being, our communities, and our collective future. So as we move into this conversation, I invite you to reflect on this. What if we built a world where no one had to fight their battles alone? Where every person, whether at a doctor's office or at a school or a moment in crisis, knew that someone saw them, valued them, and would walk with them toward healing. At Somos, this is our vision, and we hope it can be yours too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Rakami. Today, we're going to talk about loneliness and social isolation, and these are issues that have profound implications for our personal well-being and our collective lives together. To put this crisis in perspective, as Rakami said, the U.S. Surgeon General has recently declared loneliness a public health epidemic, equating its health risks to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, which I know for some of you is breakfast, but still. Yeah. Y'all should stop. And you know who you are. So about 30% of Americans report feeling lonely at least once a week. 30% of young adults report feeling lonely several times a week. Social media use is linked to rising rates of anxiety and depression among adolescents. So what has brought us to this point today, and what do we do about it? We are honored to be joined by two incredibly distinguished scholars to help us make sense of our crisis and how to move forward. Dr. Sherry Turkle is the Abby Rockefeller Mose Professor of the Social Studies of Science and Technology in the program in Science, Technology, and Society at MIT, and the founding director of the MIT Initiative on Technology and the Self. Professor Turkle received a joint doctorate in Sociology and Personality Psychology from Harvard University and is a licensed clinical psychologist. She's the author of several best-selling books, and her newest one, The Empathy Diaries, a memoir, ties together her personal story with her groundbreaking research on technology, empathy, and ethics. Dr. Robert Putnam is the Malkin Research Professor of Public Policy at Harvard University, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the British Academy, and past president of the American Political Science Association. In 2006, he received the Skite Prize, the world's highest accolade for a political scientist. He's written 15 books translated into 20 languages, both among the most cited and best-selling social science works in nearly a century. Welcome to the New York Encounter. So, to get started, both of you have devoted your careers to understanding connection and disconnection. What initially drew you to explore these themes? And Sherry, perhaps we could start with you.
I would have to start with really my first few weeks as a young professor at MIT, where Joseph Weizenbaum, who had written the ELIZA program, it was used to be called the doctor program. It was set up like a Rogerian psychotherapist. So you would say to it, I feel lonely, and the program would say back to you, I hear you say you're feeling lonely. Or you would say, I'm angry at your mother, and the program would say, what I hear you saying is you're angry at your mother. Now, this program was a parlor trick. It just kind of inverted the sentences and said back to you what this kind of stereotypical therapist might say. And Weizenbaum wrote it as an exercise in natural language processing. But what he noticed and what he shared with me really when I first got to MIT was that his students and his assistant and members of his lab wanted to be alone with it and talk with it. And in other words, knowing that the program was only giving them pretend empathy, it was empathy enough. And so he asked me to begin to talk to these many students and people in the lab who, knowing that the program could not understand or appreciate what they had to say, still wanted to talk to it. And that was really the beginning of my journey in studying what is there about where we are now, where pretend empathy from technology often seems to us like empathy enough. So that was for me, I think, the way I would approach your...
Yeah, thank you. Bob, what comes to your mind in terms of what drove you to your research?
I'm 84, so now I'm spending a lot of my time just looking back over my own career, and I can see patterns that I wasn't aware of as I was going through life. I think a lot of my interest in community came from the fact that I grew up in a really tiny town, 5,000 people, in northern Ohio in the 1950s. It was not a perfect place, but it did have an intense sense of community. Basically, everybody, at least in my high school, there weren't that many people in my high school, 150 people in my senior class. We certainly all knew each other. We all lived pretty close to each other. And even what you might think of as lines of social cleavage in that era, like race, were actually much less marked than you might think. I mean, there's a picture of my bowling team. By the way, bowling is big, so you should all think about bowling. I was on a bowling team, 5 people in my 8th grade, and the picture of that bowling team actually happens to appear on the back cover of the book Bowling Alone, and you can see it. That's why it's there. There are 3 white guys. There's a tall, skinny guy in the middle. That's me. But then there are 2 black guys standing next to me, and that reflected the fact that both on our bowling team and in the broader community, there were ties of friendship and cooperation, even across racial lines. It was not a perfect place. I'm not trying to say that, but now looking back, I can see that in some sense, I was very much affected by that sense of community in my hometown, and also in some sense trying to recreate it. I repeat, it was not a perfect world, but it was. I think that's part of the story. And even when I went to college, I've now looked back and seen what papers I wrote. I wrote papers on community. But the most important single episode, and I think I'll try to be brief about this. I'd gone to college in the aftermath of Sputnik, and I was going to be a mathematician or physicist or something like that. I was good in math, and I'd come from this little town in Ohio, and I was a moderately but still staunchly Republican, come from a Republican home, and among other things, I was also an active Methodist. And I had to take a distribution requirement, and so in the fall of my sophomore year, which happened to be in 1960, and that was a presidential election, and there were 2 guys running, which maybe people in the room will remember or not, but one was a guy named Kennedy, and the other was a guy named Nixon, and I happened to be sitting behind this cute, we would have said then, co-ed, and the class met at 11 and broke at noon for lunch, and so we got in the habit of hanging out together for lunch. Now remember, this is the late 50s, early 60s, so when I say hanging out, do not let your imaginations run away with you. All that meant was we would just get together for lunch. And, a friendship began to emerge between me and this cute co-ed. Our first day, do you all know what Sadie Hawkins Day means? Maybe, that came up. And so this girl, invited me out on a date. Our first date was she took me to a John F. Kennedy rally. That's... And of course, the next week, fairs, turned out as fair play. So I took her to a Nixon rally. And this is one tough cookie that I'm talking about. She happens to be sitting right here, actually. As I say, we've been hanging out together for whatever that is, 70, going on 75 years. So far, so good. Anyway, one thing led to another. By the election time, neither of us could vote because the voting age was 21 at that point, but I had been converted from a Republican to a Democrat in January 20th of 1961. We decided to get on the train this was at Swarthmore, just outside Philadelphia. So we got on a train at 30th Street Station and took the train down, I don't remember, it was sort of 3 or 4 hours, to Washington, D.C., and we stood in the crowd at the back. We stood at the back of the crowd when at the inauguration, and we heard Kennedy say, with our own ears, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Now, that was a long time ago, and as I said, I'm 84, but the hair on the back of my neck is standing up because I've suddenly I'm now feeling the way that adolescent felt all those years ago, because I thought he was speaking directly to me. And I always thought he was saying, you have talents, Bob. You've got things you have to do. And really on the spot, I dropped physics and math and so on, or at least I wasn't majoring in those things. I still was pretty good in math, and I became a social scientist. And after a much more turmoil, a couple of years later, I converted to from being a Methodist to being a Jew. This is one powerful lady. in a few. So that's how, as a long story. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. But that's such an important example, because as we are, the theme for this encounter this year is Here Begins a New Life, and the way in which you experience that summons to ask what you can do for your country, will that resonate with people here today, right? In a time of immense turmoil, and there's a lot that's happened since 61 that you've documented in your research that has maybe made a lot of us worry about the prospects of hope. I wonder if you might be able to say a little bit about how you found in your research the shift, the change in what you call social capital over the past century, and why it's not just a story of doom.
Sure. I'll try to be brief. I'm a data person, so there's a lot of data, but it's going to be easier. And these data come from a book that I wrote really my last book that I wrote a couple of years ago, jointly with Sheila and Romney Garrett. America's in a pickle. And not only in terms of social isolation, but that's part of it. We've reached historic levels of political polarization. I don't even need to explain that this morning. Is there anybody in the room who doesn't know how polarized we are politically? Yeah. And we're also probably at the gap between rich and poor in America is probably greater now than it has ever been in our entire national existence. So we're huge. That's in a way, that's separate. Political polarization is one thing, economics, but still there's this big gap between rich and poor. The level of social isolation, that's sort of what I call social capital. That's what we're mainly talking about here, is extremely high. It's a little hard to measure that social isolation back into the 19th century, but that's what I'm going to try to do. And then we're also very self-centered culturally. And I'm not going to say anything about exactly how I measured these things. You'll just have to. Trust is out of fashion in America, but just for the moment, trust me that I've not made up these curves, that there's a ton of data behind each of these curves. So let's have the next slide. And this looks at all the slides look the same way. The horizontal axis is time. So over at the left-hand side of the graph is the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And over at the right-hand side of the graph is now. Because this book was published a few years ago, these graphs from that book don't go all the way to 2025, but I just assure you that because we've looked at what the data looked like since the book was published, and they just keep going in the continuing down. So you can see and the vertical axis in this case is about political polarization, or we've set it up so that up is good, up is political bipartisanship, cooperating across party lines. And you can see that in the beginning of the 20th century, American politics was very tribal. Republicans and Democrats hated each other, and they didn't cooperate across party lines. And that's what that graph shows. There had been ups and downs earlier in the 19th century. There was the only time in American history when the inter-party tension was as great as it is now and as it was in around 1900 was 1860 to 1865. Raise your hand if you have any guesses as to what was happening in America between. Right. So we've got this 1860 to 65. We were pretty angry at each other politically. Then this turn of the century period at the end of the 19th century, and then now. And you can see that in between it was not constant. Actually, we had this long upswing. That's where the title of the book comes from. Between, roughly speaking, 1895, 1900 roughly, up until about the middle of the 20th century. I think the peak up there is probably in about 1955. The president at that point was a guy named Dwight Eisenhower, who was, except for George Washington, Dwight Eisenhower was the least partisan president in American history. He was nominated actually by both the Republicans and the Democrats. Eventually, he chose to be nominated by the Republicans, but he was very nonpartisan. But it's not that he caused this; he was a symptom. Does that make sense so far? That's why we got a guy like him, because we were a very cooperative country, politically, I mean. But then you can see as you enter the 60s, and especially as you enter the 70s and 80s, every year we got a little more partisan. Every year the fights in Congress got a little worse. Every year Republicans and Democrats began to feel more hostility towards each other. Every year at the beginning of the period up at the top, and you ask people, how would you feel if your child married somebody from the other party? And the typical answer to that was to laugh. Nobody could imagine being concerned one way or the other about whether your child was marrying a Republican or a Democrat. Now, the number of people who say that they would be upset if their child married someone from the other party is now about 70 or 80%. So now we really care a lot about. What I'm trying to say is the emotional feelings across that line, not just the politics, are extreme. And now we're back down even worse, very polarized. Now that you understand how the graphs work, I'm going to be even quicker. If we have the next slide, please. This is about economics. This is, roughly speaking, a measure of the gap between rich and poor. The graph here actually begins in 1914, because that's when the IRS was created. And there, beginning then, we have really, really good data, but we had pretty good data beforehand, and economic inequality was even greater in the end of the 19th century. It was called the Gilded Age, and that's when there was a huge gap between people living on the Upper East Side, where that is, and where all the rich mansions were for, the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and so on, and down here, where the poor huddled masses lived. That was what it was like at the beginning of the 20th century. But then it began to go up. There was a dip in the 20s, the roaring 20s, when people down here, people up there were making a lot of money in the stock market, and people down here were unemployed. But then, before the beginning of the Great Depression, the gap between rich and poor began to narrow, and narrowed steadily. And it narrowed, you can see it goes up and hits a peak someplace in the late 1950s, early 1960s. How equal? America in that period was tied for being the most equal country in the world. The gap between rich and poor was as small here as what capitalist America was extremely equal. Now you ask, well, what was the other country we were tied with? Sweden. So Sweden, socialist Sweden, and capitalist America were extremely equal. Believe me, we're nowhere near that now. We're now one of the most unequal countries in the world, and you can see it goes down, and again, this data goes only to 2015, but if you go up to 2025, and then you imagine what 2020 later in 25 is going to be when the Trump tax cuts for rich folks are passed. We're way more unequal than probably we've been ever in American history. That's a little hard to be sure, but we're very unequal. Next slide, we'll look at social cohesion, or what I call social capital. This is the subject of the story here. I'm going to be, and I'm not talking at all how I measure this, but actually this is measured by lots of different measures, show the same thing. How well do you know your neighbors? How involved are you in community organizations? If you bowl, do you bowl in a team or bowl alone? That is, bowling alone is, one of the underlying data sets here, but it's also trust. How much do you trust your neighbors? It's even in your own family. Do you have a family? Back at the beginning of the 20th century, a large number of Americans never married. They were called, in the language of the time, spinsters and bachelors. But then that you could see, again, that people begin to make friends, begin to get married more often. Eventually, by the time we reach the peak, everybody's getting married. That's the period right after World War II, when all the GIs were coming home and everybody was getting married. And the products of that period were the baby boom kids. And then, again, beginning sort of about 1965 or so, it begins to turn down. And then that part of this graph is the part of the graph that appears is what appears in bowling alone, which is focused. Bowling alone is focused on only one of these variables, social cohesion, and it's focused only on the period between roughly 1960 and roughly 2000. But now in this most book, we're looking at 4 different variables, and we're looking at the whole of the we're looking at 125 years, and it's down, 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 down. And okay, let's take the last graph, which is actually the most interesting graph, but I'm not going to spend very much time. I'm just going to assert this is a measure of the degree to which Americans culturally feel as if we're all in this together, or culturally feel that, every man for a woman for himself. And maybe later we can come back to exactly how I measure this, because it turns out to be important in the larger story. But again, you can see the same graph beginning in the 1890s. Americans were that was a period of what was called social Darwinism, which Darwin didn't believe, but it was a sort of a knockoff of Darwinism. Darwin said it was great that we had the fight of everybody against everybody. That made the race stronger. I mean, using his language, or the species stronger. And the social Darwinists said, yeah, that's probably true for people. It's better off if, wait a minute, listen to this. Social Darwinists said it would be better off if we taxed poor people and gave that money to the rich people, because the rich people, they said, had better genes, and therefore we would be better off if we could just subsidize the good genes. And I mean, I know this is terrible. Actually, much later, out of this comes the Holocaust, this same philosophy. But anyway, that's when we were very much an I society. Up in the middle, we were very much a we society, and we thought that we're all in this together. And then we're back down to an I society. Let's have the next slide, because this just summarizes what I've just said so far. This is the last roughly 125 years of American history. It's one large inverted U curve. We began in the 1890s as a very unequal, polarized, self-centered, socially isolated America. In the middle of this graph, in the period around 1960, we'd become quite equal, quite cooperative politically, quite connected via bowling leagues and marriage and so on, and very much thought of ourselves as one place. And then by the end, we'd back down to where we are now. And I want to say only one last thing. Almost everybody who looks at this graph wants to know what's happened up at the top in the 60s. And that's an interesting question, and I'm happy to talk about that if anybody wants to. But the more relevant part of that graph for us now is as I'm looking at the graph, the far left-hand side, the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Why is that more relevant to us now, 125 years later? Because they were in the same predicament that we are now. And therefore, I think that there may be some advantages to us trying to figure out, they got out of it, how can we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Bob.
Okay, everyone, that's a good place to stop the first half of this episode. Join us next week for the second half, where we continue the discussion between Bob and Sherry on how to move forward from our present crisis of loneliness and isolation.